All right, it's my pleasure in what I'm calling Reflections for Pharmacy Leaders Advancing the Profession to welcome Dr. Robert Elenbaas here today. Dr. Robert Elenbaas, in particular, I wanted to interview and have Bob reflect on his journey because he was one of the early clinical pharmacists, the so-called docent clinical pharmacists at UMKC, which you will have read about. So that's why I thought it was really important to interview Bob. The other reason is he was the first executive director of ACCP, the American College of Clinical Pharmacy. And the other third thing is he was really one of the early pioneers in having a career for his clinical practice in emergency medicine in the 70s. And so Bob has had a very distinguished career. He was recognized by ACCP for the Paul Parker Medal a few years back. And he's definitely significantly contributed to advancing the profession. He is a past president of ACCP, the American College of Clinical Pharmacy, and also he was active with AACP, the Association of Colleges of Pharmacy, early on as chair of the section of Teachers of Clinical Instruction, when it was referred to as Section of Teachers of Clinical Instruction, as in our early history in the 70s or 80s, I believe. So welcome, and let me proceed. Welcome, Dr. Elenbaas.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning. So the first question we would like to hear about is we want to learn about your journey to your career and recognition as a leader. And I always paraphrase this question by saying, were there key events or persons who really influence you in your journey? So go ahead, it's all yours.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me as part of this program. It sounds really very interesting. I have been very fortunate in my life, and that is I have tended to always make the right decisions for the wrong reasons, but they've all seemed to work out. So I went to pharmacy school at UC San Francisco from 1968 to 72. And that was in the very early days of when UCSF was beginning its clinical program in what was called the Ninth Floor Project, which was really a novel innovation at the time to place pharmacists on the hospital ward, and initially responsible for drug distribution, but of course that soon grew to include the clinical responsibilities that pharmacists now very much enjoy today. I must admit that when I went to UCSF, I didn't know anything about this thing called clinical pharmacy. I grew up in Southern California, and at the time there were 3 pharmacy schools in California, and it cost less for me to move from Los Angeles to San Francisco and go to school there than it did to live at home and go to school in Los Angeles. So for the wrong reason, I made the right decision, and that was to end up at UC San Francisco. And while I was there, some of the early people on the clinical faculty that had an influence on me were folks like Toby Herfindahl, who was the director of the department at the time, Don Kishi, and Marianne Coda Kimball, who eventually became chair of the department and then also eventually dean at UC San Francisco. And those were early clinical faculty that had a continued influence on me, and also got me interested in furthering my formal training and going into the residency program at UC San Francisco. Back then, a typical residency for the few people that did one was 1 year in length. And I don't know if it was because I was a slow learner or because they felt sorry for me because I didn't have a job lined up after my first year. But they asked me to stay on for a second year of residency and serve as chief resident during that time. It was very uncommon at that time for people to do more than 1 year of residency. But it turned out to be fantastic. For one thing, a gentleman by the name of Don Bestie moved to UC San Francisco and became the director of pharmacy for the Moffitt hospitals there. And shortly thereafter, Don became president of ASHP. And in the meantime, I had moved to the program in Kansas City. And one of the things that Don was nice enough to do was to ask me to serve as a member of one of the ASHP councils back in around 75 or 76. And that began to give me a taste of what being involved in professional associations was really like. But anyway, after I finished my residency, the opportunity came about to join the emergency medicine program at what's now called Truman Medical Center in Kansas City, Missouri, and to join the faculty of the Schools of Pharmacy and Medicine at UMKC. And my activities and my role in the emergency department grew as an offshoot of the docent clinical pharmacy program at UMKC. And that was really a novel program for clinical practice and education, medical education within a relatively new medical school at UMKC. It turned out that my background in my 2 years of residency ended up being the perfect training program for emergency medicine, because there was no formal training opportunities for pharmacists in emergency medicine at the time. But in my 2 years of residency, I spent about a quarter of my time on internal medicine, a quarter on general surgery, a quarter on neurosurgery, and a quarter doing administrative kinds of activities. And it turned out that that fairly broad base was actually a really good base for the emergency medicine activities. The individual who was in large part responsible for bringing a pharmacist into the emergency department was a physician by the name of Kendall McNabb. He was the chair of emergency medicine at the time. And as far as we know, this was the first time in the country that a full-time clinical pharmacist had been basically developed a practice in the emergency department. We made that claim or statement in a couple of papers that we wrote back around there. No one challenged its truth, so therefore it must be.
Must be.
And we were fortunate to do that. This was in the very early days of emergency medicine as a medical specialty. We had a residency program for physicians in emergency medicine at Truman Medical Center. At the time, it was like the third or fourth accredited program in the country. And of course, emergency medicine has grown to a very significant medical specialty now with residency training programs all around the country. But Kendall was a really significant guiding factor for me and really a mentor for me in the early stages of my career. Not only a terrific physician and surgeon, but just a terrific person. And he had faith enough to see that there might be something that a clinical pharmacist could do in the emergency department. And he also was kind enough to basically sort of let me do my own thing and develop a kind of a practice and teaching and research program in emergency medicine as we kind of jointly saw the needs to be. And I was really flattered one time. This was towards the end of his stay, if you will, as chair of the department. He moved on to become the head of the medical center's trauma team. But he told me one day, he says, you know, when we first hired you, I didn't know what you were going to do in the department. And as he was leaving, he said, and now I can't see how we could get along without you. What he really was saying is how he couldn't get along with a pharmacist in the department. It wasn't me, it was the kinds of knowledge and skills that a person with my background in education and training brought to that environment. And I think we know now that other folks have seen that value as well, because emergency medicine pharmacy emergency medicine is a really growing, expanding area.
Mhm.
Other people that influenced me at UMKC were two of my clinical pharmacy contemporaries, and particularly a gentleman named Kim Kelly and Joel Kavinsky. Both were founding members of ACCP. Both were presidents in the early days of ACCP. And they really encouraged my and facilitated my early participation in the organization. I was able to serve as a committee member and chair. I eventually was elected to the Board of Regents as secretary of the board, and then later as president of the college. In around 1986, the Board of Regents began to see that in order for the organization to continue to grow in its efforts and be successful in its efforts to meet the needs of clinical pharmacists, that it was necessary to have more of an infrastructure within the organization. Up until that time, it was entirely a volunteer organization. Wherever the treasurer was, the elected treasurer was, that's where the checkbook was, and that's where the bills got paid. The mailing address for ACCP was a cubby in the mailroom of the UMKC School of Medicine. All the work was done by the board and by committees and by really very active, interested members of the organization. And in large part, it still is. But it was also recognized that it was time to begin developing more of an infrastructure for the organization to be able to be successful in meeting the needs of clinical pharmacists at the time. So the board put out a request for proposals, an RFP, for management services. And I decided to prepare a proposal. And long story short, mine was the one that was selected because I was in Kansas City. That's where the headquarters of ACCP first was, and that's where it basically still remains, in the Kansas City area. We had about a 500 square foot office in an office building around the corner from the medical center. I was still practicing in the emergency department, and I needed to be able to get back and forth very quickly. Our initial staff was 1.2 FTEs, and I was the 0.2.
Oh, wow.
We had an administrative assistant and myself for those first couple of years. And I was still continuing my practice in the emergency department. As the need continued to expand, I began to spend more and more time with ACCP. And during this time, I basically had not 2 part-time jobs, but 2 full-time jobs. But eventually it got to the point where ACCP was requiring more and more of my time and effort. And the board of regents at the time wanted me to go be full-time with the college. And it became apparent that being a part-time practitioner in the emergency department was really something that I could no longer do. The amount of time that it takes to keep up to speed and professionally competent, whether you're working 4 hours a week or 60 hours a week, is the same.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same overhead, if you will, to be competent as a clinical practitioner. And unfortunately, I felt that I could no longer, spend the time to keep that level of competency. And so became a has-been clinical pharmacist, but began to work full-time with ACCP. And I did that, worked as the executive director through 2003, stepped down as the executive director at that time. Continued though a relationship with the college, worked part-time doing developmental work for what was then called the ACCP Research Institute, the foundation arm of the organization. Did that through early 2007. And then left there and worked even more part-time, I guess you could say, less full-time, with ACPE, the Accreditation Council for Pharmacy Education, as a team leader for accreditation site visit reviews. And I did that for about 5 years. And in 2012, my wife and I had moved to Arizona, and we decided it was time to really, truly move on to what we call our life part 2. And so now we very much enjoy a life of retirement in sunny, this time of year, very sunny Arizona.
Great.
So that's sort of my journey and some of the
Yeah.
people that influenced me.
Very good. That's great. That's very informative. So one of the other questions I ask is to reflect on your legacy. Well, a legacy, in 20 years or now. What do you think is your legacy? And I rephrase that question by asking, what are you most proud of in terms of your contributions to help advance the profession?
Well, in terms of what is my legacy, I think that's not really for me to say. I mean, that's a judgment that other people have to make. I've been fortunate enough to be able to do a few things within the profession, and it's really for others to judge, how meaningful or significant those were. In terms of the things that I'm most proud of, actually, I didn't think of this until you just stated the question in that way. But some of the things that I'm most proud of is while I was at UMKC and in the emergency department and on the faculty of the schools of medicine and pharmacy, I had the opportunity to be a part of the education and training of quite a few pharmacists. And many of whom have gone on themselves to hold very significant and important positions within the profession. And also to be very successful clinicians and scientists in their own right. And so I'm very proud of the fact that I did contribute a little bit to the education and professional development of those people. With regards to ACCP, obviously I have a certain amount of pride of and for the organization. There's no doubt, I think, that it's thrived as an organization. When I joined the staff in 1986, as I mentioned, our staff was 1.2 FTEs and we had 600 members. When I stepped down as executive director in 2003, we had 10,000 members. I'm not certain how many staff we had, but it was 8 or 10. But importantly, the organization had been successful in achieving recognition of pharmacotherapy as a pharmacy practice specialty by the Board of Pharmacy Specialties and developing, and through BPS, developing that certification process. It had been successful in developing the pharmacotherapy self-assessment program, PSAP. It had joined forces with the journal Pharmacotherapy as became the official journal of ACCP. The Research Institute was successful in helping to fund a number of starter research activities for its members and research training programs through funding of fellowship programs. So those are things that all happened during that period of time, and hopefully people will feel that contributed importantly to the organization. Today, ACCP is about 18,000 members. There are a number of pharmacy specialties that it has helped to bring on board and helps developing the basically continuing education programs for those, significant force in really the force behind the promotion of rational pharmacotherapy and clinical pharmacy within the country. So I'm very proud of that. And then also emergency medicine was a slow start, but people finally realized that stuff happens in the ER. Medicines are important in the ER, both in terms of what people do with medicines at home that affects maybe why they're there in the emergency department. And then those first few minutes or hour of treatment in the emergency department can make a very large difference in terms of what happens later with that patient. And it's not all, blood and guts and life and death things that go on in emergency departments. There's a lot of chronic care that, in essence, episodic care that takes place there. But medicines are very important. And people now realize that programs, institutions around the country are placing pharmacists in their emergency department. I believe that emergency medicine will probably fairly soon become an officially recognized specialty by the Board of Pharmacy Specialties and have its own certification process. So I think those are two things that certainly or three things I'm proud of. The people that I helped in a sense in their own professional development, my role within ACCP, and the bit that I had in maybe helping to get emergency medicine started as a
Excellent.
pharmacy practice area.
That's great. Thank you for those insights. Now, the next question has to do with advice for students in their journey as they become leaders, and maybe just a couple pearls about advice. You could probably give lots of advice, but and we like to, but
Sure.
words for students as they develop
Sure.
their journey.
Well, my first word of advice would be to make certain that whatever you're doing, you're having fun. If it's not fun, it's work, and work is no fun. So whatever you're doing, make certain that you enjoy it, that you're having fun. If you find yourself in a situation where you're no longer having fun, then do something to create new opportunities for yourself. So that would be a first bit of advice. The second bit would be, as pharmacists and health professionals, we tend to be a relatively risk-averse group of people. And that, in large part, is a good thing. You don't want a cowboy for a surgeon. You don't want, a risk-taking pharmacist, taking care of you or your medicines. So in a sense, it's a good thing that people who have risk-averse personalities tend to be drawn to the health professions. On the other hand, without getting crazy about it, sometimes you have to take a chance. Sometimes you do have to take a little bit of a risk. Now, I'm not advising people, to start jumping out of airplanes or base jumping or things like that, but you do have to sometimes take a risk. There was some risk in asking my wife and with our 6-month-old child to move to Kansas City from California. As far as when you grow up in California like I did, anything that is more than 5 miles from the ocean is back east. And nothing good comes from back east. Everything good comes from California. There was a bit of a risk in moving our young family from California to the Midwest. And joining, an emergency medicine program. I didn't know anything about emergency medicine. I'd been there once or twice during my residency on a code, but that was about it. So was I good enough to make it? What if the professional environment in Kansas City and at Truman Med Center and UMKC wasn't as rich as we thought it would be? What if we just didn't like living there? Those were all potential risks. But we took it and it worked out. There was definitely some risk in leaving the security that I had created within the emergency department and at UMKC to move to ACCP. It was a young fledgling organization at the time. Quite frankly, it didn't have a lot of money. What if we found out that over time they really couldn't pay my salary? At the time, ACCP was considered kind of a rogue organization. There were some people that would have been very happy if ACCP wasn't there. What if somehow my being involved in a significant way within the organization somehow stained my professional reputation and made me unemployable in a lot of people's minds? Those were risks. But we considered, and this was all of these things were joint decisions with my wife and myself. We considered these potential risks to be worth it that the benefits that we foresaw would be worth the risk. And indeed, that it turned out. I mean, looking back now, who knows how our lives would have been if we hadn't done these things. We do know how our lives have been having done these things, and we wouldn't have traded, a minute of it.
Absolutely.
So my two advices are have fun and don't be afraid to take reasonable risks.
Right. Very good. Thank you for those comments. And the last, real briefly, when we study the decade of the 2020s, one of the key milestone or turning point in that will be COVID-19 pandemic, what we're living through now. How do you see that, especially in terms of when we read the history about that it was a turning point for our profession, it was an opportunity, and it was really a turn, like other significant events in history are?
Well, it's probably too early to tell right now because we're still in the midst of this. And the reason why we're talking by Zoom here today is that, I'm sequestered here in Arizona and fortunately our golf course is still open so I can get out.
Oh, wow.
But one thing, if this pandemic has shown anything, it has shown how weak and ill prepared the public health system is in our country for these kinds of things. Our public health system, our emergency preparedness system is probably better than it would have been pre 9/11. But it's still focused on being able to address very small, relatively small, localized kinds of disasters. A tornado, a hurricane, the possibility of a terrorist attack, things like that. I don't think anybody envisioned that we would have to deal with the kind of not just national but global pandemic kind of a situation that we find ourselves in now. So the opportunities, I think, are going to be in the new kinds of opportunities are going to be to really strengthen pharmacy's role as a meaningful part of our nation's public health system. And pharmacists being the frontline practitioners for much of the public are, of course, in a fantastic place to do that, whether it be through public education, screening down the road, and hopefully in the not too distant future, immunization opportunities. So that's, one very obvious thing. There may very well be others, that people who are a little bit closer to the situation than I am now. I'm a old retired clinical pharmacist. I'm not in the trenches anymore. So, the younger people, the people that are in it right now, I'm sure are in a better position to see even more opportunities than what I've alluded to here. But that's one that comes to my mind, is our public health system is woefully in need of being stronger in this kind of an area. And I think it's probably safe to say that whatever, there was 100 years between the Spanish flu pandemic in the early 1900s and this pandemic. I would be willing to bet it's not going to be 100 years until the next pandemic comes along. And so hopefully we'll be more prepared with our experience and knowing how better to use our health professional and health resources to address these kinds of things in the future.
Very good. Thank you very much, Bob. Thank you.